You wore that to Mom's funeral? My sister, Cassandra, sneered. Her diamond cuff caught the afternoon sun, nearly blinding me, as she flipped her perfectly styled hair. I mean, I get it, Grace. Times are tough for you. But couldn't you have at least tried? Mom deserved better than off the rack. I smoothed down my simple black dress, hiding a smile. What she didn't know? I designed this dress. I felt the $60,000 bioengineered spider silk shifting against my skin, soft as a shadow and stronger than steel. Cassandra called me a stain on the Vance bloodline. She had no idea she was currently wearing a brand she couldn't afford to buy, owned by the very sister she was insulting. To the world, the mastermind behind G Atelier was a reclusive ghost known only by the pseudonym E. Valerius. I never granted interviews or showed my face, allowing the brand to speak for itself while I remained a shadow. Welcome to Narratives by Nora channel. I'm behind the wheel today, reflecting on how easy it is for family to misjudge us while we're quietly building our own path. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'll be sure to read your stories once I pull over. For now, let's get back to Grace and her calculated clinical retribution. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't even feel the urge to raise my voice. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I watched her for a moment, tilting my head like an observer watching a failing experiment. She was posing near the altar of the Palo Alto Cathedral, adjusting her borrowed cuff, so the light would hit it just right for the cameras. She looked perfect. At least, that's what her 60,000 social media followers would think. I stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the back of the modern glass structure. The walls looked like they were weeping from the mist outside, but my eyes were dry. I pulled out my military-grade encrypted phone. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. Action was the only currency I had left for them. I didn't think about childhood memories. I didn't think about shared holidays. I opened the administrative portal for G Atelier, my global fashion empire. My thumb hovered over the screen with lethal precision. One tap to pull up Cassandra's file. One to verify the breach of the morality clause. One to click terminate, effective immediately. I hit send. The screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. In the 30 seconds it took for that digital command to process, her life as she knew it ended. The $20,000 monthly stipend? Cancelled. The company-funded penthouse? Eviction notice pending. The global modeling contract she used to brag about at every dinner? Void. I looked through the glass. She was laughing now, leaning into our brother, Tyler. Tyler was probably monitoring whatever financial disaster he was juggling at the bank this week, his eyes darting to his phone every few seconds. Our father, Gary, stood near them in an Armani suit from 5 years ago, still trying to play the patriarch while his real estate holdings turned to ash. They were all living leveraged lives, posing in borrowed finery, breathing on credit. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me over the years. They were only going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and the Vance family was finally entering the red. I moved away from the crowd of mourning socialites, my boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. Each step felt like a drumbeat in a war I had already won. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 29 years, and today, I was finally liquidating my position. My family had spent a lifetime calling me the Vance failure, while my brother, Tyler, was off earning an expensive MBA funded by our mother's hidden savings, and Cassandra was posing for cameras. I was in the garage. My mother's old garage, the only place in Palo Alto that didn't feel like a stage set. It smelled of ozone, old sewing machine oil, and the quiet dust of secrets. They mocked me for playing with fabric. They saw a girl with thread under her fingernails and assumed I was content with scraps. Gary, my father, would stand in that garage doorway, his eyes fixed on his $6,000 watch, telling me I was a phase, not a future. He'd kick a pile of my silk samples and laugh about how I was living in a dream world. I never argued. I just recorded the interaction in my mental ledger. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because I was wearing the invisible chains of a survivor. For years, I lived in a jail without bars, a mental space of calculated patience. I allowed them to believe I was the failure so I could map their true nature from the shadows. I watched them rent their status with high-interest loans and hollow lies. I sat through 20 consecutive Christmas dinners being the pitiable sister, while I spent a decade in R&D, eventually launching G Atelier through a senior proxy to hide my age and identity until the empire was too big to ignore. This wasn't a breakdown of character. It was a strategic observation. The contrast between us was clinical. They were the performance. I was the reality. While Gary was leveraging the family home for the third time to chase a tech deal that existed only in his head, I was buying up the debt he used to posture. My mother was the only one who understood the alchemy of my silence. She taught me that the strongest seams are the ones you never see until the garment falls apart in your hands. She knew that my playing with fabric was actually the construction of a fortress. I had survived them by becoming invisible. But being invisible doesn't mean you aren't there, it just means you are the one holding the lights while everyone else is blinded by the stage. They had overdrafted my compassion for decades, treating my presence like a utility they didn't have to pay for. Now, standing in the back of this church, I realized that my silence had finally served its purpose. I had seen enough. The observation phase was over, and the audit was beginning. The reception was an exercise in performative grief, a carefully staged production where the appetizers cost more than the sincerity. Cassandra had her phone out before the first tray of hors d'oeuvre even left the kitchen, her thumb moving with a practiced, predatory twitch. She wasn't just mourning, she was content creating. I watched her through the crowd as she began a live stream, her voice dropping into that syrupy, fake tone she used for her followers. "Hi guys," she whispered into the camera, pouting beautifully for 60,000 viewers. "It's been such a hard day, but even in our grief, we have to think about others. My poor sister, Grace, is trying so hard to keep our mom's tiny sewing shop running, but times are so tough for her. If you could all just drop a donation, or head to her little boutique, it would mean the world to our family." She turned the camera toward me, capturing my cheap black dress in high definition. I didn't flinch. I stood there with my terrible paper cup of coffee, watching her use my mother's funeral as a backdrop for a digital pity party. The notifications on her screen were scrolling by thousands of people pitying the struggling sister exactly as she intended. Before I could move, a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. It was Gary, my father. His face a mask of stern patriarchism that didn't quite cover the desperation in his eyes. Tyler was right behind him, his jaw set in that aggressive way he used when a deal was going south. They didn't offer a word of comfort. They didn't ask how I was holding up. This wasn't a family moment. It was a transaction. They pulled me into a dimly lit hallway near the back of the cathedral. "Grace, enough with the games," Gary hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Tyler's bank is hit with an audit, and my latest development is 2 weeks away from foreclosure. We need liquidity, and we need it now." "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked, keeping my tone as flat as a balance sheet. "Mom's memorial fund," Tyler snapped. "She left it in a trust for future designers, but we both know that was just a sentimental whim. We need you to sign the transfer papers tonight. We use that capital to bridge the loans, or we lose the house. And if we lose the house, you lose that little boutique you're so obsessed with. Consider this your eviction notice if you don't comply." I looked at them, and I saw the trap of normalized cruelty in its purest form. For 29 years, they had spent so much time exploiting me that they had convinced themselves it was their right. In their heads, they weren't being monsters. They were simply managing an asset they deemed inferior. They had normalized the idea that my life, my work, and my mother's final wishes were merely collateral for their own failures. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a systematic belief that my only value was what could be stripped from me to save them. "I'm not signing anything," I said quietly. Gary's face turned a deep, mottled red. "You ungrateful little failure. We gave you everything, and now you're going to let your brother go to prison and your father lose his legacy over a pile of fabric? You didn't give me everything," I corrected him, my voice factual and lethal. "You gave me the bare minimum required to keep your image intact. Now, get out of my way. I have an empire to run, even if you're too blind to see it." I walked past them, leaving them fuming in the shadows. I didn't need to argue anymore. I had already seen their hand. Now, it was time to play mine. The predator's mask was off, and beneath it, they were just drowning men. I didn't answer a single text as I walked to the parking lot. My 12-year-old Honda Civic was my invisibility cloak, a humdrum sedan that blended into the Palo Alto scenery, while the luxury SUVs of my relatives screamed for attention. I drove north towards San Francisco, the city skyline cutting through the fog like a jagged glass edge. Silicon Valley is built on the performance of power, but the real control is often buried underground. By the time I reached the secure facility in the Mission District, the Grace they knew, the struggling shopkeeper, was dead and buried alongside our mother. I bypassed the public lobby and entered through the freight elevator. my thumbprint clearing 5 levels of biometric security in under 2 seconds. The doors opened to the subterranean hub of G Atelier. Here, the air was filtered, the lighting was surgical, and the only currency was truth. Alyssa was waiting for me with a digital tablet and a stack of acquisition files. "The market hit for Western Pacific Bank is accelerating," she said, her voice as crisp as a new invoice. "And your father's primary holding company? We've secured 65% of the distressed debt. Buy the rest," I instructed, not breaking my stride as I walked into my private office. "Every cent. I want to be the only person Gary Vance owes money to by the end of the business day." "Understood. We're also monitoring the liquidation of the mother's estate," Alyssa added. I stopped at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the digital feeds of my global supply chain. This was the moment I realized the gravity of my intervention. If I hadn't spent the last 15 years building this fortress in the dark, the world would have been a much colder place for my mother's legacy. Without G Atelier, Gary and Tyler would have stripped Patricia's life of every ounce of meaning, turning her boutique into a parking lot and her memorial fund into a bribe for a failing auditor. In a world without the vision I'd protected, they would have successfully erased the one person who actually cared about substance. My mother's values would have been a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. "Miss Vance," a lead auditor interrupted, stepping into the room with a look of intense concentration. "We've found the seams in Tyler's reporting." I sat at my desk, the black glass surface reflecting a version of me my family had never bothered to see. "Explain." "It's not just predatory lending," the auditor said, sliding a file across the desk. "He's been moving intellectual property through offshore accounts. But there's a discrepancy in the authorization signatures. The dates don't match the public records." I looked at the documents, and for the first time, my clinical focus shifted into something sharper. My brother wasn't just a failure at business, he was a criminal, and he was using our mother's name to hide the blood on his hands. This wasn't revenge anymore, it was accounting, and the Vance family was about to find out that every debt eventually comes due. The audit wasn't just a financial review, it was an autopsy of my brother's character. As I sat in the surgical glow of the underground G Atelier headquarters, the data didn't just scream failure. It whispered of a deep, calculated betrayal. My lead auditor scrolled through a series of digital authorization forms for our proprietary textile patents, the very bioengineered silk technology I had spent 15 years perfecting in secret. The names at the bottom of the transfer documents were mine and my mother's. But the forensic analysis was undeniable. The legal loophole he used was undeniable. He had exploited a durable power of attorney he'd pressured our mother into signing months ago, claiming it was for her medical protection. Tyler hadn't just been greedy. He had been a predator. He used that legal authority to drain her accounts and move assets while she was drifting in and out of consciousness during her final weeks. He was attempting to misappropriate the intellectual property rights for a secret offshore deal worth $40 million. He wanted to sell the soul of my company to save his own sinking bank. The brother who had mocked my addiction to fabric at every Christmas dinner was now trying to build his salvation on the very threads he'd spat upon. I stared at the screen, my heart rate never climbing above 60 beats per minute. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was frozen into a sharp, clear diamond of logic. This wasn't a family squabble or a sibling rivalry anymore. This was a federal crime. It was wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate espionage at the highest level. My brother had officially moved his life from the boardroom to the criminal court. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single memory that might make me hesitate, but there was only the cold clarity of a balance sheet. My brother's debt to the family and to the law had reached its limit. He wasn't shocked by his own actions. He was only going to be shocked that his pitiable sister was the one who caught him. "Alyssa," I called out, my voice sounding like the snap of a high-end shear. "Ready the final dossiers. I want the criminal complaint to the state attorney general's office, the foreclosure notices for my father's holdings, and the ironclad proof of the patent theft." "Is everything in place for the morning?" I asked, already standing to leave. "Yes, Miss Vance," Alyssa replied. "They've already requested an emergency audience with the CEO. They think they're coming to beg a stranger for a bailout." "Good," I said, picking up the black leather portfolio containing the files that would end their world. "Let them arrive with their hats in their hands. They're about to find out that the mysterious Valerius isn't a savior, she's the auditor of their consequences." I walked toward the elevator, the weight of the portfolio feeling like a heavy, final curtain. This wasn't a family meeting. It was a closing of the accounts. Gary, Tyler, and Cassandra didn't just walk into my office. They stormed in, their collective panic radiating off them like cheap perfume. They had received the liquidation notices, and the bank freeze alerts. An hour ago, they were cornered animals, and they had come to the top floor of the Atelier Tower to beg for their lives from a person they only knew as the mysterious E. Valerius. Gary led the pack, his borrowed suit looking more like a shroud now. "We need to see the CEO immediately," he barked at my assistant, his voice cracking with the ghost of a power he no longer possessed. "We have a family emergency. Our holding companies are being targeted by a hostile takeover." I sat with my back to them, looking out over the San Francisco harbor through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I listened to Cassandra sob about her career and Tyler whisper about legal loopholes that no longer existed. They were pathetic. "Please," Cassandra wailed toward the back of my chair. "Everything is being taken from us. My contract, my home. If the CEO could just sign a bridge loan of $5 million, we could fix this." I waited for the silence to stretch, for the weight of their desperation to fill the room until it was suffocating. Then I slowly turned my chair around. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum being created, as the oxygen left their lungs. Gary's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Cassandra's phone, which she'd been holding to record her bravery, dropped to the floor with a dull thud. Tyler just stared at me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Surprise," I said, my voice cold, clinical, and perfectly even. "Grace?" Gary whispered, the word tasting like ash. "How? This is a boutique. I am the owner of Atelier," I corrected him, "and I am currently your only creditor. I didn't steal your power, Gary. I just stopped lending it to you." This was the intellectual payoff of the last 20 years. I watched as their world didn't just crumble. It evaporated. Their power had never been a part of them. It was an illusion, a costume they'd rented with debt and social status. They had confused the appearance of having with the reality of being. Without the borrowed capital and the performative wealth, they were empty vessels. Their status was a facade built on a foundation of air, and I had simply pulled the plug. I slid 3 envelopes across the black glass of my desk. "Cassandra, your termination is final. There will be no mediation. Tyler, your abuse of power of attorney and fiduciary fraud have already been reported to the State Attorney General's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And Gary," I looked my father in the eye, "the formal notice of foreclosure for the Palo Alto property will be served by 5 p.m. today. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the locks are changed." They were no longer the predators. They were the casualties of an audit they never saw coming. The power flip was complete. I wasn't the failure of the Vance family. I was the only one who actually owned my life. The resolution was a quiet, clinical settling of accounts. Gary moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, a space managed by one of my third-party trusts. He spends his mornings in a simple polo shirt and khakis, stripped of the armor of his Armani suits, learning for the first time what it means to live within a fixed budget. Tyler's indictment for federal fraud, identity theft, and forgery was swift and irrevocable. He is currently awaiting his sentencing, finally understanding that, in a court of law, you cannot leverage a lie into a profit or post a bond with empty promises. Cassandra is now starting at the bottom, not at my company, but at a third-party textile recycling facility in a remote district, earning minimum wage to pay back her legal settlements. She is on her feet for 9 hours a day, organizing fabric swatches and updating spreadsheets, learning that true fashion is about service and labor, not just the surface. I did not save her career, but I gave her the only thing she actually needed, an opportunity to earn her own dignity from the ground up. I have officially transformed our mother's old garage into the Patricia Legacy Fund. It is no longer a place of hidden labor or silence, but a sanctuary for young designers from disadvantaged backgrounds. We provide the capital, the resources, and the mentorship that Gary and Tyler once tried to suffocate. This was my act of planting a seed, turning the ruins of a toxic family dynamic into a forest of opportunity for those who have been overlooked by the world. I have come to realize that letting go of a toxic bloodline is not an act of malice. It is a profound and necessary act of self-preservation. For 29 years, I believed that family was an unbreakable contract, no matter how much they overdrafted my compassion. But I was wrong. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is to stop performing a role that was designed to keep you small. You find your true self only when you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to your failure. On my desk sits a single pearl button from my mother's wedding dress, the only inheritance that has any real meaning to me. It is small, luminous, and resilient. It is a reminder that the most beautiful things in life are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to finally look beneath the surface. If you are listening to this, and you feel like the invisible one or the spare in your own family, please remember my story. You are not a burden, and you are not a failure. You are a masterpiece in progress, and your worth is not determined by the people who don't have the eyes to see you. Do not be afraid to build your empire in the silence. The best revenge isn't the destruction of others, it is the construction of a life so bright that their opinions no longer have the power to cast a shadow. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to those who hurt you. It is the key you use to set yourself free. If Grace's journey inspired you to reclaim your own narrative, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. Until next time,